I'm Ashley.
And I'm Sema.
And we're going to be talking about Chapter 12.
The central nervous system.
We'll first start with the regions and organization of the brain. There are 4 major sections. First up is the cerebral hemisphere, which is the superior part of the brain where you do most of your major thinking. Let's take a closer look at the 3 landmarks that separate the lobes of the brain. We have the gyri, which are ridges and raised parts of the brain. It'll be right here. Then we have fissures, which are big dips or cracks between the gyri. There are 2 types of fissures. We have the longitude fissures, which splits the hemisphere right here. This would be the longitudinal, and then it splits the hemisphere. And then we have transverse. This separates the cerebrum from the cerebellum. This is right here, where this is the cerebellum, and this is the cerebrum. All right, and then the sulci are grooves and valleys. So grooves right here. There are 3 subdivisions of sulci. We have central sulcus, which is here. This central sulcus divides frontal and parietal lobes. Then we have the parieto-occipital sulcus, which is right here, and that separates the occipital lobe from the parietal lobe. And then we have the lateral sulcus, which is right here. This separates the temporal lobe from the parietal lobe and the frontal lobe.
Now we're going to talk about the cerebral cortex, which has gray matter. Gray matter is not myelinated, has slow impulses, and controls thinking. There are also 3 functional areas of the cerebral cortex. There's the motor area, which controls motor functions, the sensory area, which makes us aware of what's happening, and association area, that integrate information and make sense of things. Then there is the contralateral control, which means the left side of the brain controls the right side of your body and vice versa. And there's lateralization, which is your dominant and non-dominant side of your brain. Your left side of the brain is like language, math, right side, music and art. And then there's the Brodmann's areas, which is the map of thickness of your cortex. Moving on to the lobes of the cerebral cortex and their primary functions, we're going to start with the frontal lobe, which contains a prefrontal cortex, your forehead, it's your personality and who you are. The Broca's area, or speech production, is usually on the left side of the brain and is responsible for motor speech, which is the moving of the tongue, the mouth, vocal cords to make the sounds. Then there's the somatic motor cortex, prefrontal gyrus, which is in front of the central sulcus, which is voluntary motor movement. Then you have the olfactory area, which communicates smell. Moving on to the parietal lobe, there's a somatosensory area, which is the post-central gyrus and is your sense of touch. Then there's taste, your simple taste from the tongue, not your nose. And then the general interpretation area, also known as gnostic region, usually on left side, and it puts info together. The occipital lobe is in the back of the brain, or the back of the head. It's almost all visual. There's a primary visual cortex, which sees what you're looking at, and the visual association area, which makes sense of what you're seeing. Moving on to the temporal lobe, which is your auditory area, you have the Wernicke's area, language. Towards the back is involved in language, sounds out unfamiliar words, is on the left side, and same part of the right side is body language. Then there's a general interpretation area, also exists in temporal, makes sense of information, and the olfactory area. The last lobe is the insula, which is lobe on inside. So in the insula, you have your equilibrium area, which is for balance. You have your visceral awareness area, which is how your intestines feel, for example, a full bladder, and language, which helps interpret different tones.
Here's a diagram of the ventricles of the brain. There are 2 lateral ventricles, which are the C-shaped structures. Then we have the septum pellucidum, which is the dividing membrane between both C-shaped structures. Next, we have the interventricular foramen, a whole passageway to connect lateral ventricles with the third ventricle. Third ventricle, which is between the halves of the thalamus. And then we have the cerebral aqueduct, which connects the third and fourth ventricle. Then the fourth ventricle, which is down under the brain, where the cerebellum is. Lastly, we have 2 lateral and 1 median aperture, which carries CSF, cerebral spinal fluid, into the spinal cord and into the body.
Okay, the cerebral white matter is in between gray matter, is myelinated, and connects areas of the cortex. There are 3 different types of fibers,
Commissural fibers,
which connect gray areas on each hemisphere,
association fibers,
which connect different parts of the same hemisphere.
and projection fibers.
They run up from the lower brain to the spinal cord.
Now we're going to talk about the diencephalon. There are 3 major structures inside the diencephalon. We have the thalamus, which is the spot right here. It's a big relay station for sensory info to proper parts of the brain. For example, memory and learning. Also sort and editing, which controls access to the cerebral cortex. Next we have the epithalamus, which is this red part here, which consists of the pineal gland, which regulates melatonin and the sleep-wake cycle. Then we have the corticoid plexus, which is the blue area here. It forms and circulates the cerebral spinal fluid, and the epithalamus consists of ependymal cells. Next we have the hypothalamus, which is here. This is the main control center for autonomic. Mammillary bodies, which are here. Relay for olfaction, which is smell. Infundibulum, which is the stalk that connects the hypothalamus to the pituitary gland. The pituitary gland produces lots of hormones. Functions of the hypothalamus are autonomic control centers, blood pressure, heart rate and force of contractions, GI tract mobility, respiratory rate and depth, pupil diameter, regulation of body temperature, food intake, water balance, thirst, sleep-wake system or cycle, and endocrine system. Okay, now the brainstem. We're going to talk about the midbrain. It's the nuclei, which consists of gray matter. Reflex center is largest midbrain nuclei. We have 3. There's superior colliculi, which is visual. The top 2 visual reflex coordinates the head and eye movement. Also tracks moving objects. Inferior colliculi, which is auditory. Bottom 2 auditory reflex, loud sounds and startle reflexes. Motor centers, substantia nigra, areas that contain lots of melanin. Red nucleus, which means lots of blood cells that contain descending motor pathways. Then we have white matter, which is the cerebral peduncles, contains motor tract. Conduction pathways between lower and higher brain centers. It connects the lower parts of the body to the brain.
Pons are bulges that regulate respiratory rate and depth, fine-tunes breathing, connects to brain and connects spinal cord and cerebellum. It's for coordination of muscles. And nuclei relay between cortex and cerebellum.
Medulla oblongata, a conduction tract, connects body to the brain. Decussation of pyramids, pathways that connect to muscle tracts, motor impulse to make muscles contract. Spinal cord to higher brain center. Nuclei, somatosensory relay to cerebellum, which connects the visceral nuclei, which has the cardiovascular center, heart rate and blood vessel diameter, respiratory center, respiratory rate and depth. Others, for example, are coughing, hiccuping, vomiting, sneezing, and swallowing.
Okay, so now we're going to talk about the anatomy of the cerebellum. First, there's folia, which is fine gyri. And then the cerebellum has two different hemispheres, the right and left. The vermis is actually located in between the two hemispheres. And there's lobes, anterior, posterior. Then the arbor vitae, which is white matter structure in gray matter of the cerebellum, and it's also myelinated. The cerebellar peduncles connect the cerebellum to the brainstem. Right side of the cerebellum controls right side and vice versa. Some functions we can talk about. It monitors and connects voluntary movements, example autopilot, and cognition, language, and problem solving. Functional brain systems. There's the limbic system, which is your emotional brain. It connects your feelings and thoughts. And there's also the reticular formation, which is the core of the brainstem, reticular activating system that keeps you awake and alert. If this is if it's twisted or damaged, it can cause a coma. So for the protection of the brain, we have things called cranial meninges. Meninges are membranes that cover the brain. There's the dura mater, which is the strongest, and it's the outside layer membrane. Then there's subdural space, which is filled with fluid. Arachnoid matter, thin membrane, kind of looks like a spider web, hence the name arachnoid. There's the subarachnoid space where you find CSF, cerebral spinal fluid, and where you find arachnoid matter. And then lastly, pia mater, which is stuck to the brain, anchors down capillaries. Okay, cerebral spinal fluid floats our brain, and its composition is mostly water. There is, however, glucose and ions as well. The carotid plexus is the structure that makes CSF. There's a bunch of capillaries that are kind of leaky, and CSF is ependymal cells recycle it every 8 hours. Then there's the blood-brain barrier, which is a structure that keeps proteins, ions, and some drugs away from the brain. And it's covered with astrocytes, will let in glucose and some amino acids.
Protection of the spinal cord. There's a vertebral column, which is made of vertebra cage, which surrounds the spinal cord. Then we have the spinal meninges, which are membrane around the spinal cord. And they consist of epidural space outside, dura mater filled with adipose veins. Dura mater, like in the brain, only has one layer. Subdural space, tiny space, deep to the dura mater filled with synovial fluid. Arachnoid, deep to subdural space, web-like. Subarachnoid space, in between web strands filled with cerebrospinal fluid. And pia mater, which is on spinal cord itself. External anatomy of the spinal cord. Cervical enlargement is a thicker spot where nerves leave and come back to arm. Lumbar enlargement is down in lumbar vertebra where nerves leave and come back to the legs. Denticulate ligament, where it attaches the spinal cord to the vertebra. Conus medullaris is a cone-shaped structure at the end of the spinal cord. This ends around L1 or L2 and then breaks apart. Filum terminale is where pia mater anchors spinal cord from conus medullaris to the coxils. Quada equina breaks apart and forms a bundle of nerves.
The sectional anatomy of the spinal cord has the anterior median fissure. It tells you which direction the spinal cord is facing. The posterior median sulcus, which is tiny, it's opposite of anterior. And gray matter, which goes in and out of spinal cord. The middle core of the spinal cord kind of looks like a butterfly. And then you have gray commissure with central canal. It's in the middle. It's a passageway for CSF and connects both sides of gray matter. The horns are projections of gray matter from commissure. There's anterior or ventral gray horns. 2 points to anterior side contain mostly cell bodies of motor neurons. There's the posterior dorsal gray horns, which are mostly interneurons. and lateral gray horns, which are neurons that serve visceral organs.
4 functional zones: somatic sensory, touch sensory into spinal cord, visceral sensory, stomach full, hungry, visceral motor, lateral horn, time to move small intestines, somatic motor, which is voluntary movement. Spinal roots and nerves. Dorsal roots are posterior roots that carry afferent in fibers. Sensory info comes in. Ventral roots is anterior roots. White matter. There are 3 columns of white matter. You have anterior white columns, posterior white columns, and lateral columns. Tracts are ascending sensory tracts that go up to the brain. Descending motor tracts go down from the brain, and transverse tracts are one side to the other. Homeostatic imbalances, subdural or subarachnoid hemorrhages, bleeding into cranium and increases pressure.
Alzheimer's disease, which is degeneration of brain tissue.
Spina bifida, which is incomplete formation of vertebra.
Cerebral palsy, lack of coordination from motor neurons.
Thanks for watching Chapter 12, the Central Nervous System with us.